the Medium's book right here on Kardec Radio. This is the Medium's book, chapter 8, part 2, Laboratory of the Invisible World. So thank you very much for joining us, and let's get started. This chapter is very interesting. It talks about let's just bring some images here for you. It talks about initially on how discarnate spirits can make things appear, physical objects, for example. It discusses the idea that discarnate spirits show up in clothing, which Kardec uses the term spirit clothing. So the whole thing is about how is that possible? Is it possible? Or it's just imagination, hallucination, whatever it is. Is it possible? How can it create objects or these apparitions of objects? Is that possible? Yes or no? This is what the chapter discusses in the Medium's book. So Allan Kardec is very smart, as we know. So he wants answers. In order to get the answers, he uses his, which I believe is a great method. He, of course, studies a lot. He makes his own questions. He puts his questions together. And as he goes along to these spirit meetings, these mediumistic meetings, he will ask the spirits these questions, sequentially or not, in order to gather the whole picture and be able to pass it along to us. So he starts studying the possibilities of these, spirit clothing, apparition of objects, and all of that. How is that possible? He analyzes some of the possibilities. At one point, he brings the idea that, for example, spirits can direct writing something. Direct writing means it is not needed the presence of a medium. So there is no medium. We don't need the medium's hand to write anything. Direct writing occurs because there's a piece of paper sitting on a table, for example, and then the discarnate spirit, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, you will generate the words and put them on paper without anybody using hands. So it's not necessary to have a medium to do this, which is even more challenging to explain. So that's the scope of work on this chapter, a laboratory of the invisible world. As he goes along investigating the process, he gets to a point where he needs, so he has a theory, he has an idea, but he goes to these and he places these questions. The spirit who will answer the questions and give us is a spirit that shows up in the weekly meetings that they had. And it was a great of great value to the entire codification, not only the Medium's book, but to the entire codification by answering questions, bringing new information, and so on and so. So he starts asking, Allan Kardec starts asking about these apparitions, how is that possible? So he asks, what we see, is it really object? Can we touch it? How is that? So Spirit St. Louis will say that, yes, the objects that were created or are created by spirits, they are real objects, meaning they can be made real objects. Somebody, incarnate person, pick up the object, put their hands on it, and everything works as if that was just another object sitting on a table, for example. And Allan Kardec says, well, if you bring, for example, a box with something inside, is the person supposedly that was created by a discarnate spirit, is a person able to go in, open the box, and pick up the contents, for example? And it says, yes, if it was created to be used that way, yes, you will. You will work. So then the challenge begins. How come? Explain. And at one point, Spirit St. Louis is going to say it all has with the ability that discarnate spirits, it depends on the level of a spirit is in, but according to that, they are able to produce, things more precisely, less precisely. They're able to produce or not. For less advanced spirits, they're not able to do anything like that. And then the explanation is in the ability that these spirits have to modify the properties of matter. That's what they do in order to make these things happen. Modify the properties of matter. Well, for us, it might seem a little strange. How can we modify the properties of matter? Well, let me bring something here for you. From God, two things emanate. And we've discussed this in other programs. But from God, two things emanate. Spiritual principle, which is the seeds of anything and everything that one day is going to be intelligent principle, spirit, and also God, the material principle. The whole creation happens when the spiritual principle interacts with the material principle to form things. That's how the whole creation comes about. So, the spiritual principle has to be present in absolutely everything. So, for example, things like think of a chair, for example. A chair. Does it have spiritual principle? It's a tricky question. Yes, it does. You see, I'm not saying it has a spirit. A spirit is a very, very advanced form of an intelligent principle that one day started as spiritual principle. So the spiritual principle is the seed of everything that's going to be intelligence one day. Now, if there were no spiritual principle in the chair, how come the atoms and molecules and whatever else would be held together to form the chair? You would just disappear, dismantle altogether. So there is principle in there. So there is spiritual principle in absolutely everything. Absolutely everything. So spiritual principle is the form of intelligence that will create these things, will make these things happen in the visible world. And then he starts asking more questions to find out a little bit more. And finally, Spirit St. Louis says, if you understand, we don't have the ability to fully understand that yet. But when we understand how matter works and the interaction between the spiritual principle or the intelligent principle and matter, it's a lot easier for us to uh, uh, understand the whole thing. Now, for example, and then one of the questions is, what we see is it's an actual object, or it's just a projection, it's just a representation like an icon or so. You see, we are dealing with this in the 1860s, where we had much simpler vocabulary, much less technology, much less comprehension and understanding of scientific processes and phenomena, much less. We are much more advanced now. So If you bring this into modern times, think about an hologram. What is that exactly? If you project, for example, an hologram of a person, is that the person? It isn't. But if the hologram is really, really, really well built and perfect, we might look at the hologram and say, that is the person. This is Mr. Such. And it isn't. It's not even a representation of the person. You see how difficult it is to explain, even with modern terms. And a hologram is much more, it's much closer to what it is in the invisible world than in the 1860s. Still, a hologram has no mass, no energy. So you can't say it's the person. The hologram gives us an idea of the person being there. It will be built by discarnate spirits. Again, more precisely or less precisely, according to two things: the ability of the spirit and its intention. The spirit's intention to produce that object, for example. So when we look at this from a different point of view, not in the 1860s, but 60s, but now, a hologram is something that is becoming more common in our days, more popular. We still have a bunch of questions. People who are not in the technical area that have a million questions about it. Some cannot understand, some have a hard time understanding. However, it's something that it's part of our days now. Science has got this far. And that is, if science, would you please keep the proportions of the analogy. If science is able to produce a hologram that we believe it's the object itself, the person themselves, it's more or less the same thing. The discarnate spirit can produce something similar. So for us, living now in 2025 is not so hard to understand how this could happen, how this could be. It was in the 1860s when Allan Kardec tries to explain all of that. There are no words, there is no vocabulary. This dialogue with Spirit St. Louis that's going to respond to all the questions. You say he's not